So I'm going to speak about what's in it for all of us and opportunities to newcomers with disabilities. And I'd like to frame human rights as a social good, as a way to engage other sectors in the conversation, sort of what's in it for them, what's in it for us, all of us. And on its own, the settlement sector has limited influence over employment for this community. We only have access to so many levers. And so we need to get the attention of and work with various sectors for maximum impact and inclusion. So the first thing I want to talk about is poverty. In Ontario, the intersection of immigration and disability has tended to be one of deep socioeconomic disadvantage. And yet we know that newcomers are generally highly skilled and educated. They're a group with a whole lot to contribute. But instead, they tend to be relegated into poverty where their strengths and talents are untapped. And we really all lose when talent goes unrecognized and marginalized. And we lose even from a broader perspective in that health is a social determinant, or poverty and income is a social determinant of health. And so it ends up costing society a whole lot more to deal with sort of the downstream consequences of poverty. So hiring a diverse workforce isn't just the right thing to do. It's actually really strategic. And diversity is a strength, particularly for organizations, because newcomers with disabilities strengthen an organization's ability to understand and reach target markets, target communities. Diversity in the workplace enables community partnerships and building trust with the diverse communities that we serve. And diversity also helps break down what is called groupthink. It improves decision-making by adding different perspectives into the pool of knowledge. And it's really a driver of innovation. And if you can imagine all the different places where newcomers with disabilities are coming from in the world, they're bringing innovation and ideas sort of internationally into Ontario, into Toronto. So it's a real asset. And then organizations that are committed to reducing barriers for customers and for employees benefit from the insights of both newcomers and people with disabilities because they challenge taken for granted practices and designs by exposing the barriers that have long gone unnoticed. And an example of this is when I organized a session and paid $3,000 for a session on inclusive, accessible spaces at Toronto Public Health. And I'll tell you, the speaker was great, but what was all the more valuable was that we had people with disabilities, our own employees, come to those sessions, and it was really their stories of the barriers that they encounter each day in the workforce that were so valuable and brought the issue of accessibility to light. So they're a real important partner in building an accessible organization. They were able to identify all kinds of things that able-bodied people take for granted day in and day out. So that's the kind of insight that it's really priceless. You can't pay for that amount of insight, and it's a value added when you have somebody that can speak from that place in your workforce. And also, when newcomers with disabilities are not represented in the workforce, it reinforces the idea that they are a burden and a drain on the Canadian system. So implicit biases are really difficult to address because they work outside of our conscious awareness. By putting the skills of newcomers with disabilities to work, we actually disrupt those biases and those stereotypes. No group should be disadvantaged by unfair assumptions. It leads to exclusion, whereby the assets of newcomers with disabilities succumb to the myths that are all around us. And I wanted to just take a moment to zero in on those myths. And the greatest myth is that people with disabilities are liabilities in the workforce. And the research shows that, in fact, employees with disabilities are good for the bottom line. In other words, social fairness offers great rewards, not only for society in general, but for business as well. So here are some things that as I was perusing the internet, I ran into a Deloitte study that found that retention is stronger when you hire a person with a disability. They tend to be more committed and loyal to their employer. And contrary to popular belief, they have less absenteeism. And they're more careful and vigilant workers and tend to have less workplace injuries. So diversity, inclusion, and human rights, they're not just moral issues, they are business strengths. And I think it's really important to adopt some of that language because employers need to be a key partner when we're talking about access to employment for newcomers with disabilities. And so the language of human rights really needs to be translated into language that makes business sense. So some examples that I talked about are poverty doesn't just affect poor people, it has broad social consequences that we all pay for, whether economically or even socially by virtue of marginalizing a great pool of talent. Newcomers with disabilities are assets, not liabilities, and the diversity they bring to the workforce is a really essential strength. Thanks.